in the last part of the lecture, I talked about how the Meiji government tried to create a state religion focusing on Shinto and emperor worship in order to unify the people's minds around the singular task of modernizing and making sure that Japan would be strong enough to repel any Western attempts to colonize it. Now, the difficulty was that in order to be accepted by Western nations, Japan needed to have a modern Western-style constitution, and in fact, Japan was the first non-Western nation to create one. The Meiji Constitution promulgated in 1889. Important in that constitution was the guarantee of religious freedom, written over here. You can read it more carefully on your own. That was particularly important for Western nations because Christianity had actually been outlawed by the previous Tokugawa government, and it was important to show that they were a modern nation, that Christianity would be not only tolerated, but of course Western nations wanted to proselytize in Japan as well. So they had a freedom of religion clause, and therefore it became a question of, well, is the government in fact creating this state religion based on Shinto, and if it's a state religion, how can people really be free to believe in whatever they want? So what happened was they changed how they talked about Shinto. They actually formally distinguished the version that Westerners usually refer to in English as state Shinto from some sects. There's 13 of them, some of which are still around, and they called that sect Shinto. And they were separate organized religions, and they had to abide by a different set of rules that governed religion in Japan at the time, whereas what we call state Shinto, the specifically government-regulated administration of shrines and the use of Shinto-based ideas and practices to generate this kind of nationalist spirit, that was regarded merely as a set of cultural practices that were non-religious in nature, even though one might argue that they certainly used a lot of religious kind of beliefs and practices. An example of that would be this Imperial Rescript on Education, promulgated just after the Constitution came out. This is something that from this period right to the end of World War II that all young people would have been indoctrinated with. So you would go to elementary school and there would be an assembly, and the principal of the school would come out in a very formal Shinto kind of clothing and present before an image of the emperor. He would present this formal document. You can read it below, and we'll take a look at it in class. But the substance of the document is, one could quite possibly agree, not particularly religious or not fundamentally religious. It might have some religious qualities, but it basically says you should be a good citizen, and you should be filial to your parents, be a good son or daughter, and you should serve the nation if called upon to do so. Not, terribly religious in nature, but the reason that this maybe went beyond simply a set of cultural beliefs and practices is that people were made to make obeisance to this document. That's to say, to bow down to the ground, and with this image of the emperor up in front of them, to essentially perform a kind of religious ritual and revere the emperor, not just out of respect, but perhaps something more, as a living deity, which essentially he was. That was what the state Shinto was doing, was suggesting that the emperor was a living deity. This was challenged quite early on when a Christian school teacher said he had no problem with the document itself, but that he couldn't bow down to it because that would be transgressing his religious freedom as a practicing Christian. And interestingly enough, it wasn't that the state forced him to do it, there was no court case that forced him to do it, but rather public opinion itself sufficed. All of the newspapers vilified this person. and said that this was totally unacceptable. And it became clear that in order to be a Japanese citizen, it would be necessary to adhere to these beliefs and practices. So sure, there were some people that struggled against this, but very few, and anybody who really tried to reject these beliefs and practices definitely was given quite a difficult time, either by the government or by peers in society. Another example of an idea which is raising this state Shinto to something of a strong religious character would be Kokutai, translated here as the national entity. It's more literally translated as the national body. And we have created images here, this one with the sun goddess and the second one with the emperor. They're actually Buddhist images. We will talk about these ideas in Buddhism later in the course, but they're called mandalas, and they represent a picture of the entire universe, and what would be in the middle would be a cosmic Buddha. And I've replaced it to show how Shinto at the time was drawing very heavily on Buddhist ideas, and even though I made the image, not the Shinto people of the time, but essentially this is what they were doing. They were taking a Buddhist idea that said that the entire universe is all interconnected, it's a single body, and that body is the body of the Buddha in the original version, or as we have it here, the body of the sun goddess slash the emperor, which down below I have a similar version with Emperor Hirohito, the emperor during the World War II. And so the idea is that the kami created the universe, and the kami are embodied in the living person of the emperor, and therefore this Kokutai centers on the emperor, and it is only through the emperor that a Japanese person would be able to fully partake of his or her proper identity, that is to say, the oneness with the totality of things, in particular the oneness with Japan, the oneness with the emperor, with the sun goddess, and the other gods of Japan. And so the idea is transformed from just being loyal to the emperor to you really don't have any existence apart from your relationship to the state through the emperor. That, of course, would be very useful in wartime in getting people to do anything to serve the nation, such as at the end of World War II, you've probably heard of kamikaze, where Japan had completely run out of all of its resources. There were no bullets left, and they would take whatever they could and put it into a plane and turn it into a kind of flying bomb. And the pilot would have to fly that plane directly into the target, say a ship. And you're getting people to commit suicide, which is perhaps slightly different than just going into battle and being willing to die, but to know that you're going to kill yourself for the emperor, that takes a certain kind of a mindset. And one could certainly argue that state Shinto provided precisely that kind of a mindset. Of course, this all ended very badly. At the end of World War II, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Japan, and that finally brought the war to an end. And also, the U.S. occupation forced Emperor Hirohito to make a public declaration where he explicitly told the Japanese people that he was not a living kami as they had always been taught, and that kind of shock of being told from the beginning of the Meiji period in 1868 and increasing throughout that period all the way up until 1945, being told that the emperor is a living god and that Japan has a special destiny, etc., etc., and then suddenly to have Japan lose the war and have the emperor deny that that is in fact the case, that he's a living god. It really brought Shinto down from the heights that it had climbed to be such an important part of the Japanese identity. From that period on, it's a little more complex. There certainly are some people who continue to be very closely identified with the Shinto tradition, whereas others would not say that Shinto is their religion, but as we'll talk about in in class and when we look at the material on the Yasukuni Shrine, it's a contemporary issue, it's a little bit complicated because Japanese people continue to engage in Shinto practices at various times, even if they don't necessarily regard it as their religion. Shinto continues to function as, in some ways, a kind of state set of beliefs and practices that may not be forced upon people to the extent that they had previously been, but are certainly still widely part of Japanese culture.